All right, strap yourselves in because today we're diving deep into the music industry. We're looking at the legal battle between Kirk Burroughs and Sean Puff Daddy Combs, and wow, this one's a doozy.
It's a case from 2006, but it still gets brought up today, even in like legal circles.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it touches on a lot of legal issues that still matter today.
That's fascinating. Okay, so Kirk Burroughs and Sean Combs, they were partners, right?
Yeah.
At Bad Boy Entertainment.
At Bad Boy Entertainment, Burroughs was actually one of the first people to really help launch Puff Daddy's career.
Good to see.
And then in 2005, things went south, and Burroughs ended up suing Combs.
And what were the claims? Like, what was he suing over?
Oh, Burroughs claimed a whole lot of things. I mean, we're talking breach of contract, we're talking fraud, and there's even this crazy incident where he claims there was a baseball bat involved.
Wait, a baseball bat? Okay, hold on. We have to rewind. What's the story with the baseball bat?
So in 1996, Burroughs says that Combs threatened him with a baseball bat to try and force him to sign away his part of Bad Boy Entertainment.
Oh, wow.
And to add to the drama, Combs' lawyer, Kenneth Meiseles, was supposedly there when this all went down.
Oh, man, that's intense. So on top of the baseball bat incident, Burroughs also claimed that Combs messed with his business by convincing Mary J. Blige to leave him.
Yeah, that's right. Burroughs said that Combs convinced Mary J. Blige to break her talent management contract with him.
So that brings up this whole legal idea of interfering with a contract, right?
Exactly. It's called tortious interference with a contract. Basically, it means that someone intentionally gets in the way of an existing contract between two other parties.
So let's say you and I have a deal for you to paint my house, but then someone comes along and talks you out of it.
Right.
And convinces you to paint their house instead. Would that be tortious interference?
Yep, that's a good example.
So with Mary J. Blige, Burroughs is saying that Combs interfered in his contract with her.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, in court, you can't just say someone meddled. You have to prove that their actions directly caused the contract to be broken. It's this idea called but-for causation.
Oh, I see. So it's but for this person's actions, the contract would have been fine.
Exactly. The court needs to see that direct link.
Gotcha. Now, I'm a little confused about the timeline here. This baseball bat incident was in '96, but Burroughs didn't file this lawsuit until 2005. That's almost a decade later. Why'd he wait so long?
Right. Well, there's this thing called the statute of limitations. Basically, each state has laws that set a time limit for when you can file certain types of lawsuits.
Oh, like a deadline.
Yeah, think of it like if you and your friend had an argument, you can't keep bringing it up years later.
Right.
There has to be some kind of time limit.
Makes sense.
Otherwise, things would get messy. So these time limits are there to make sure legal claims happen within a reasonable amount of time.
Okay, so how did Burroughs try to get around that deadline? A decade seems way past any deadline.
Well, he argued that Combs hid information from him. He said he couldn't have known the full extent of what was going on until much later. He also claims he was actively trying to find out the truth all along.
So he was being diligent.
Yeah, that was his argument.
Okay, so did the court buy it?
Well, here's where things get really interesting legally. This 2005 lawsuit is actually connected to a lawsuit Burroughs filed earlier against Combs back in 2003.
Oh, there's another lawsuit.
Yeah. In that one, Burroughs accused Combs of violating the RSA Co. Act. That's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. But the court dismissed that case because the statute of limitations had already run out. Now, because this 2005 lawsuit had a lot of the same facts and legal issues as the earlier ISE case, it triggered something called collateral estoppel.
Collateral estoppel. Okay, that sounds like a mouthful.
No, right? Basically, think of it like this. Imagine you and your roommate are arguing about whose turn it is to do the dishes.
Okay.
You finally agree on a system for who does what, right? Well, you can't keep re-arguing that same point every time the sink's full of dishes.
Okay, I get it.
You had your chance to argue. The decision was made. You have to stick with it.
So you can't keep bringing up the same issue over and over.
Right, and that's kind of what collateral estoppel does in legal terms. It prevents the same legal issue from being relitigated between the same people.
Okay, so because the court had already made a decision on these issues in the RKO case, Burroughs couldn't just bring them up again in this new lawsuit.
Exactly.
So the outcome of that earlier case really messed things up for him in this 2005 lawsuit.
Yeah, you could say that. The court had already shut down Burroughs' arguments about the statute of limitations in the RKO case.
Okay, so then what happened to the rest of his claims in this 2005 lawsuit? Did they just throw them all out because of the deadlines?
Pretty much. The court dismissed most of them, including the breach of contract claims, because they were filed too late.
Wow.
But there was One claim that wasn't dismissed right away, that claim about Combs interfering with Mary J. Blige's contract.
Huh. Why did that one survive?
It seems like the court needed more info to decide if that specific claim was also too late.
So they weren't sure if the deadline had passed for that one?
Right. They wanted to look at the evidence and see if there was really a strong enough link between what Combs did and Mary J. Blige leaving Burroughs.
So this whole case really highlights how crucial it is to know about legal deadlines.
Oh, absolutely. You could have the best argument in the world, but if you miss the deadline, you might be out of luck. It's a big reminder for everyone, even if you're not involved in some high-profile music industry feud.
Yeah, you really have to know your rights and make sure you're acting within those timeframes.
Exactly.
It's kind of wild to think about how statutes of limitations and collateral estoppel played such a big role in the court's decision.
Yeah.
But even with all the legal stuff, I think what's really interesting is the human drama behind all of this. You've got Kirk Burroughs and Sean Puff Daddy Combs, right? They were friends, partners.
Yeah.
And now they're like battling it out in court.
It really makes you think about the whole thing with ambition, you know?
Yeah.
Loyalty and betrayal, and maybe even like the price of success, especially in a field like the music industry.
It is competitive.
It is, yeah.
And speaking of roles, I'm also curious about the lawyers in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
We know that Kenneth Meiselas, Combs' attorney, was allegedly there during that baseball bat incident in '96. It makes you wonder, like, what are the lines that lawyers have to walk in these situations?
For sure, lawyers, they have this duty to represent their clients, you know?
Right.
Fight for them. But there's also a whole code of ethics they have to stick to.
Yeah.
It's a tough balance sometimes.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about Mary J. Blige.
Oh, yeah, she got caught right in the middle of this whole thing.
She did. She was managed by Burroughs, but then she ends up signing with Bad Boy. I mean, talk about a conflict of interest.
Definitely a classic conflict of interest. And this situation really shows just how complicated the relationships are in the music industry.
For sure. Artists, they often have contracts with so many different people. And sometimes, yeah, things clash.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about the legal ins and outs of this case, but I'm kind of curious about the bigger picture. Did the court ever actually say whether or not what Combs did was ethical? I mean, even if it wasn't technically illegal?
That's a good question. I mean, from what we see in the documents, they didn't really dig into that ethical side. The court's focus was strictly on, you know, the legal stuff.
So we're left to make our own judgments.
I guess so. The court might have said that Burroughs' claims were too late, but that doesn't mean they were like, oh yeah, what Combs did was totally fine.
Right. So maybe legally it's over, but ethically there's still questions.
Absolutely. And that's probably why this whole case still has people talking, even all these years later. I mean, it makes us think about power, about loyalty, and, you know, what people are willing to do to succeed. It's messy.
It's really interesting to think about what might have happened if things had gone differently. Like, what if Burroughs had sued sooner?
Yeah.
What if he'd had more proof? Could things have turned out differently?
It's definitely possible. I mean, statutes of limitations are important, but they can be kind of tricky when you think about how sometimes people don't even realize they've been wronged until much later.
It's true. And what about the judge? Like, what if a different judge had been in charge of the case? Could their own opinions have changed the outcome?
It's hard to say for sure. Judges, they're supposed to be impartial, right?
Yeah.
But they're also people. You know, they have their own experiences, their own views.
Yeah.
So it's possible, but we can't know for sure. It's an interesting thought, though.
It is. And this case also makes me think about how much public opinion matters. Sean Combs, Puff Daddy, he's a big name. Do you think that affected things?
It's hard to say for sure, but I mean, public opinion can definitely have an influence, even if it's not something that's like officially acknowledged in court.
Right.
These big cases, they get so much attention from the media, it shapes how people see things.
Yeah. And sometimes that pressure from the public can actually achieve things that the courts can't.
Yeah.
You know, like think about boycotts or protests or even like online campaigns.
Oh, for sure.
They can really change how people think and even make powerful people change what they're doing.
You're right. I mean, the legal system is supposed to be fair, but it's not perfect. Sometimes it takes that public pressure, people speaking out, to hold those in power accountable.
This whole case, it's like opening up a can of worms. It shows how even what seems like a simple legal fight can bring up all these complicated questions about what's right, what's wrong, who has the power, and what justice really means.
I agree. It reminds us that legal battles, they're just one part of a much bigger story.
And we're back diving deeper into this whole saga with Kirk Burroughs and Sean Puff Daddy Combs. We've really gone through it all, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. Contracts, legal deadlines, all that power stuff, and the crazy world of the music industry. It's fascinating.
It is. So as we wrap things up, I want to hear your final thoughts. What does this whole case tell us about the connection between law, ethics, and personal responsibility?
Well, to me, it really highlights how important it is to understand your legal rights, no matter what you do in life, you know?
Yeah.
Like whether you're signing a contract, starting a business, or just navigating relationships in your career, you got to know the rules of the game.
Absolutely. And it's not just about knowing the rules. It's about having the guts to stand up for yourself if you think you've been wronged. I mean, Kirk Burroughs went up against Sean Combs, a giant in the music industry. That's a big deal.
Yeah, he did. And even though it didn't turn out the way he probably wanted, him taking that stand, it sends a message, doesn't it? It shows that even if it seems like you're fighting an uphill battle, you can still challenge the way things are and go after what you believe is right.
Yeah, he didn't back down.
Yeah.
It's also important to remember that these legal battles, they can really take a toll, emotionally and financially. It makes you think about what Burroughs went through.
It does. Taking legal action, it's a long, tough road, and there's no guarantee you'll win. You really have to weigh the costs and what you might gain before you jump into something like that.
That's true. But sometimes the biggest victories, they don't happen in court, you know? They happen when people see you being brave and standing strong, even when things are unfair.
That's a good point, a really good point. And maybe that's the real takeaway from this case, the part that sticks with us. It reminds us that even when the legal system might not deliver, people can still persevere, and fighting for what's right, well, that's always worth it.
What an incredible conversation. Big thanks to all of you listening in for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and maybe even started looking at the world a little differently. Thanks for being here. Imagine pleading guilty to a crime, but then turning around and arguing, wait a minute, I didn't actually break the law.
Yeah, talk about a head scratcher, right?
It's a wild situation. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. United States v. Caswell Sr. This case throws a wrench into the whole idea of compassionate release and how judges make those tough calls.
Absolutely. It really gets at the heart of what accepting responsibility means, legally speaking, when someone's trying to get their sentence reduced.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of Senior's case, can you give us a quick rundown of compassionate release in general, for those of us who aren't legal experts?
Of course. In a nutshell, it's a way for federal courts to potentially shorten someone's prison sentence. But, and this is key, it's only granted under very specific, strict circumstances. We're not talking about just a change of heart here.
Okay, so what kind of situations are we talking about?
Think serious medical conditions, like a terminal illness, or maybe someone is of advanced age and their health is declining rapidly in prison. Sometimes it's even granted because of extreme family circumstances.
Like if the person in prison is the sole caregiver for a child or a sick family member.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those truly extraordinary situations where keeping someone behind bars might not make sense anymore. Now, this particular case, it all hinges on a specific part of the law, 18 U.S.C. Section 3582C1. Sounds like legal jargon, I know.
It does sound a little intimidating.
But basically, it's the rule book for when a judge can even consider modifying a sentence.
So it's like the first hurdle, right?
Yeah.
Before compassionate release is even on the table.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Senior's case really puts those rules to the test. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Absolutely. So let's get into it. What landed Caswell Sr. in this situation in the first place? Why is he asking for compassionate release?
Well, he based his entire request on what he called an extraordinary acceptance of responsibility for the crimes he committed. And this is where things get interesting.
Because he's admitted to robbing someone, but now he's saying it wasn't technically robbery.
You got it. He took a plea deal, admitted to the robbery, but now he's arguing that what he did didn't actually meet the legal definition of robbery.
So wait, is he trying to have it both ways? Saying he's sorry, but also that he didn't really do anything wrong?
It certainly seems that way, doesn't it? And that's the issue the judge in this case, Judge Halpern, had to wrestle with. Can you claim to accept responsibility while simultaneously saying, but I don't think I actually broke that law? It's a tricky territory.
It sounds like a real legal puzzle. So
Yeah.
How did the judge even begin to unravel this? What was his reasoning for denying compassionate release?
Well, to understand Judge Halpern's decision, we have to look at his ruling, which was divided into two parts. He had a very specific thought process.
All right, so two parts to this ruling. Break it down for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so two parts to this ruling. Break it down for us.
Right. So first, Senior had to prove there were what the law calls extraordinary and compelling reasons for letting him out early.
Ah, so it's not enough to just say, hey, I've changed my ways.
Exactly. The bar is set really high for compassionate release. And while the law does give judges some wiggle room to decide what counts as extraordinary and compelling, in Senior's case, Judge Halpern wasn't convinced.
I can see why that would be a tough sell, given how he's arguing both sides.
Exactly. Pleading guilty, but then saying you didn't technically break the law, it kind of undercuts the whole remorse thing, you know?
Yeah, tough to argue you're super sorry for something you don't think you did wrong.
Right. It's a bit of a contradiction.
So that's hurdle number one. What about the second part of the judge's reasoning?
Okay, so even if Senior had cleared that first hurdle, and it's a big if, the judge also has to consider what are known as the 18 U.S.C. Section 3553A factors.
More legal jargon.
Okay.
Lay it on us. What are those exactly?
Haha, don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Basically, these factors are like a checklist the judge uses to make sure the punishment still fits the crime, even if someone is asking for a reduced sentence.
Okay, so it's about making sure the punishment is fair and makes sense overall.
Precisely. They want to deter future crime, protect the public, those sorts of things. And a key factor here is the seriousness of the original offense.
Right, so in Senior's case, how much time he's served so far would come into play, right?
You got it. And this is a key detail. Senior had served less than 20% of his sentence when he filed for compassionate release.
So even if the judge was moved by his claims of remorse, he'd have to balance that against the fact that Senior hadn't served very much time.
Absolutely. Judge Halpern basically said releasing him early wouldn't really achieve those bigger goals we talked about, like deterring others from committing similar crimes. It comes back to that balance, recognizing potential rehabilitation, sure, but also thinking about justice for everyone else.
Makes sense. So zooming out a bit, what does this case tell us about how judges make these really complicated decisions about compassionate release?
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about navigating this tension between acknowledging someone might be changing for the better, like genuinely accepting responsibility, while also making sure the punishment still serves its purpose. And Judge Halpern actually pointed out that Senior already got some credit for taking the plea deal. Initially, it factored into his sentence.
So it's almost like, we already gave you credit for that back when you were sentenced.
Exactly. And it highlights how complex these cases are. Judges aren't just looking at legal checkboxes. They're trying to understand all the angles, the individual's actions, and the impact their decisions have on society's sense of justice as a whole.
So much to think about. Senior's case really throws a wrench in things.
It really does. And it begs the question, what does accepting responsibility really mean? Is it just saying the words, or is there a deeper level of understanding required?
Deep stuff.
Ugh.
It really makes you think, if you were the judge in this situation, what would you do? Would you prioritize Senior's claim of remorse, even with all the contradictions, or would you focus on the fact that he still has so much time left on his sentence?
Wow, yeah. That's the million-dollar question, right? It's tough. I wish I had a simple answer for you, but there's no easy solution here. It's a judgment call every single time. Judges have to juggle so many things. The law, past cases, the specific arguments being made, and ultimately they have to rely on their own understanding of justice.
So there's no magic formula, no checklist they can just follow?
Nope. It's about grappling with those gray areas. In Senior's case, it definitely throws a wrench into things, makes us confront those places where the law and what feels fair, might not perfectly line up.
It does. For someone listening who's fascinated by the legal system, what do you think is the biggest takeaway from all of this? The one thing they should remember about compassionate release?
I think it's important to remember that compassionate release isn't some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. It's a long shot. It's a process with a really, really high bar for approval. And there's a good reason for that. We're talking about potentially shortening someone's prison sentence. It shouldn't be easy.
It's not just about saying, oh, I'm sorry, and walking free.
Right. And as we've seen, even when someone claims they're taking responsibility, there's still no guarantee. It's up to the judge to look at the whole picture, weigh everything, and decide what serves justice best.
It's definitely a balancing act. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into United States v. Caswell Sr. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of a much bigger conversation.
I agree. Accountability, remorse, what justice really means, those are questions we're always going to be grappling with.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they continue to explore these ideas on their own?
Here's a question to ponder the fact that there's no easy answer in Senior's case. Does that make compassionate release seem more problematic, or does it highlight why it's so essential? Think about it.
Ooh, good one. Definitely something to chew on. Well, on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that very question. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating and sometimes baffling world of compassionate release. Until next time. All right, so you know how much we love to dig into the stories behind the headlines? Well, get ready for a wild one. Today, we're diving deep into all the allegations surrounding Sean P. Diddy Combs. And let me tell you, this one's got more layers than a puff pastry.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking decades worth of accusations here. Assault, coercion, even human trafficking. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it definitely paints a different picture of the guy we saw in those shiny suits, making hit after hit.
Right, and that's actually a key part of this whole thing. The video we're looking at really emphasizes just how much power and influence Diddy had, especially in the music industry.
He wasn't just some artist. He was calling the shots, shaping careers left and right.
Exactly. He was a kingmaker, you know? And when you have that kind of power, it makes you wonder, how was it used? Was it used to silence people, to keep them from speaking out?
Especially because these accusations didn't just come out of nowhere. The video mentions all these whispers about Diddy's behavior that were circulating way before any lawsuits were ever filed.
Oh, yeah, like way back in '99, there was that assault lawsuit. And then you have the accusations about what was going on in his clothing factories, the labor violations.
Let's not forget the whole Biggie and Tupac thing. Those rumors never really went away, did they?
Nope. They definitely added to this image of Diddy as a guy who always seemed to be surrounded by controversy, like where there's smoke, there's fire. But then 2023 hits, and whoa, things really explode, starting with Cassie Ventura's lawsuit.
That felt different, like a turning point.
It was. I mean, first of all, it broke the silence. Suddenly other people are like, wait, maybe I'm not alone here. But Ventura also alleged this really disturbing pattern of abuse. We're talking coercion, assault, even being forced into sex acts with male prostitutes.
The video called them freak-offs.
Yeah.
Just joke.
Yeah. Not mincing words there.
So Diddy's lawyer denies everything, calls Ventura a liar, but then they settle out of court. Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it?
For sure. I mean, a settlement doesn't equal guilt, right? But it definitely raises questions, especially because, and this is important, Ventura's lawsuit happened right when New York passed that Adult Survivors Act.
Which, just so everyone's on the same page, that law basically gave victims of past abuse a chance to sue, even if way too much time had passed.
Exactly. So this legal window opens up, and all of a sudden, bam, 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 Diddy's hit with all these lawsuits. And the accusations are eerily similar: assault, coercion, even human trafficking.
Like a pattern was finally coming into focus.
Right. But just as things couldn't get any crazier, guess who gets involved?
The feds, which is never a good sign.
Not at all. And it wasn't just a little peek either. The video made it sound like they were building a whole racketeering case against Diddy, claiming he used his companies to cover up criminal activity.
Okay, so we're talking about some serious legal trouble here. What exactly does that even mean? Racketeering.
So basically, the indictment portrays Diddy's whole operation as this calculated system of intimidation and violence. They even allege drug use was involved, all to control people, keep them quiet. And get this, the feds actually seized evidence, including recordings and a crazy amount of baby oil.
They found what?
Thousands of bottles allegedly used in these freak-offs.
Wow, that is a lot to unpack. But when you hear those two words, federal charges, things just got very real. Their conviction rate is no joke.
Absolutely. This is serious business. And the feds are still investigating. In fact, they're encouraging anyone with information to come forward. They clearly believe there's more to the story.
Yeah, when you hear the feds are involved, it's like, this isn't just tabloid drama anymore. This is the real deal.
It really is. And it makes you think about all the people who might have been afraid to come forward before,
Exactly. Because if you're going up against someone with that kind of clout, it's intimidating, to say the least.
To say the least. And that's what makes these allegations from Lil Rod so interesting. Remember him? Another music industry figure.
Oh, yeah. His lawsuit kind of adds a whole other layer to this whole thing. He's not just accusing Diddy of, harassment and threats. He's saying he saw this stuff firsthand.
Yeah, and some pretty disturbing stuff, too. Like, Lil Rod claims Diddy would actually record these encounters he had with people, almost like he was trying to collect, compromising material on them.
Oh, wow. Talk about a power move.
Right. It's like, imagine the control you would have if you had something like that over someone. And Lil Rod didn't hold back either. He named names.
He did, including Diddy's own son, Justin Combs,
Mm.
though he was later removed from the lawsuit.
Yeah, but still, it just shows you how deep this whole thing goes. And it makes you wonder, who else knew about this? Who else might have been involved? Like, the video mentions that at one point even Universal Music Group got dragged into this.
Wait, hold on. Universal, as in one of the biggest music labels on the planet.
The one and only. Now, they were later removed from the lawsuit too, but the fact that their name even came up, it makes you think.
It makes you think, like, how high up does this go? Like,
Yeah.
were people looking the other way because it was Diddy?
Exactly. And it's not just about Diddy. It's about the whole system, the culture that might have allowed this to happen. This culture of, don't bite the hand that feeds you, especially in an industry as cutthroat as music.
It's like that whole too good to be true thing. You get promised fame and fortune, but what happens when you realize it comes at a cost you never agreed to pay?
And who are you going to tell?
Oh,
All right, you're up against these powerful figures, these huge corporations.
It's scary and heartbreaking to think about the people who might have been trapped in those situations, feeling like they had nowhere to turn.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to ignore the elephant in the room here, these freak-offs the video kept mentioning.
Right.
The planning, the coercion involved, it's just, disturbing doesn't even begin to cover it.
No, it really doesn't. And the detail about the feds finding all that baby oil, that wasn't just some random coincidence. That speaks to a whole other level of darkness, It's
Like he thought he was untouchable.
Exactly. Like the rules didn't apply to him.
Which is why I think those federal charges are so important.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying, no, this isn't just how the music industry works. This is criminal behavior, and we're not letting it slide.
And they're not. They've made it very clear they believe there are more victims out there, more to this story than we even know.
It's kind of chilling when you think about it. Like, we see these glamorous industries, music, movies, and we don't often think about what might be going on behind the scenes.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the fantasy of it all.
Totally.
Boy.
And this whole Diddy situation, it's like a wake-up call. It makes you realize these power imbalances, they can pop up anywhere.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about the music industry, right? We've seen it in Hollywood, in sports, even in politics. It's like anywhere there's power, there's a potential for abuse.
It's a human problem, not a music industry problem.
Exactly. It's this thing in us, this need to create these hierarchies, these systems where some people are on top and some are at the bottom. And then we trust the people at the top blindly instead of,
Instead of questioning things, holding them accountable.
Exactly. We need to be questioning these systems constantly, encouraging people to speak up, not just, go with the flow, look the other way.
Right. Because if we don't say anything, if we don't demand better, nothing's going to change.
And change is possible, but it takes all of us. It takes awareness, education, and action.
So what can we actually do? Like, what's a concrete step we can take to make sure this kind of stuff doesn't keep happening?
Well, first, educate yourself, right? Understand how these systems work, how this kind of abuse can fester. And then support organizations that are fighting for victims' rights, organizations that are trying to prevent this from happening again.
And maybe even more importantly, when someone speaks out, believe them, support them. Because coming forward, especially when you're going up against a powerful figure, that takes serious guts.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Speaking up, even when it's terrifying, that's how change happens.
It's like that saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
Wow. Powerful stuff.
This whole deep dive into these P. Diddy allegations, it's been intense.
Yeah.
And honestly, at times, it's been pretty damn hard to hear.
For sure.
But you know what? It's important. We can't just look away from these uncomfortable truths.
Nope.
Because the more we know, the more we understand, the better equipped we are to actually make a difference.
Exactly. Knowledge is power.
It really is. Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been real, as always.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
And remember, if you or someone you know needs help, you are not alone. We'll be sure to include some resources in the show notes. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.
Okay, so get ready because this deep dive, it's going to be a heavy one. We're dealing with some really disturbing stuff, allegations of abuse and power dynamics, and what looks like a massive cover-up that could go back decades.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, and it's important we go into this with our eyes wide open.
Absolutely. And you might be tempted to think, oh, this is just another day in Hollywood, right? Another celebrity scandal. But trust me on this one, this goes way beyond the usual gossip.
I agree. This isn't about bad behavior. This is about potential systemic abuse, and that's a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. And the scale of this thing is just mind-blowing. We're talking about attorney Tony Busby. He held this press conference and just dropped a bombshell saying his firm has been contacted by over 285 people.
Oh, 385.
385 people, all with accusations against Sean Diddy Combs. And we're not talking about just recent years. This goes all the way back to 1991.
That's over 30 years of potential abuse.
Yeah.
So the question that immediately comes to mind is, why now? Why are these claims surfacing after all this time?
It's like you said, this isn't just some isolated incident that happened yesterday. This is,
Yeah, it's a pattern. And it's a question that deserves a nuanced answer. Part of it has to do with the legal concept of revived claims. Some states, they recognize that it can take years, even decades, for victims of abuse to come forward, especially when we're talking about people who were minors at the time.
right, because trauma like that, it can be incredibly difficult to process, let alone talk about.
Exactly. These laws, these revived claims, they provide a legal avenue for these victims to seek justice even after all this time.
So it's like these laws are giving a voice to those who were silenced for so long.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the legal aspect either.
Huh.
We have to remember the psychological impact of trauma. You take years to process what happened, to even admit it to yourself, and then even longer to find the courage to speak out.
And seeing others come forward, that can be a catalyst, right?
Absolutely. It's often called the domino effect. When one person bravely breaks the silence, it can empower others to share their own experiences.
Mm.
Busby's announcement, it seems to have opened those floodgates, and what we're seeing now is this waves of accusations that paint a very, very disturbing picture.
Yeah, and you said it before, but this isn't just about one person's alleged actions. This is about a pattern. Busby described a chilling modus operandi, and it's like something out of a nightmare.
It's a classic case of power and control dynamics sadly playing out on a massive scale.
So walk us through this. What did Busby say about this pattern? Because I got to tell you, when I was reading through the source material, it was like each detail was more unsettling than the last.
Right, and that's no accident. These patterns are often designed to be insidious, to operate in the shadows.
Yep.
But let's start with the beginning with what Busby called the lure.
And I think this is where it gets really insidious, right? Because it's not like some obvious threat. This is about exploiting people's dreams.
Precisely. According to the allegations, it often involved the promise of opportunity and access invitations to exclusive parties, after parties, even auditions. Imagine the appeal for a young, aspiring artist, eager to make their mark in the industry.
It's like dangling the brass ring right in front of them, and who wouldn't be tempted to reach for it?
Exactly. And that's where, according to Busby, the pressure would escalate. He described victims being offered drinks, often laced with drugs, with the implication that refusal wasn't really an option.
And this is where things take that dark turn, because we're not just talking about a little something to loosen people up. He specifically mentioned a horse tranquilizer called xylazine.
Which, if true, is horrifying. Imagine being drugged without your knowledge, losing control over your own body, and then,
according to the allegations, comes the abuse. Busby spoke about sexual assault often taking place in front of others, leaving victims not just physically injured, but deeply traumatized.
trapped in a nightmare, because this is where the threats allegedly came in. Threats of violence, threats to their careers, threats to their families.
So it's like being caught in this web of fear and intimidation.
Exactly. And that fear is what keeps people silent. Because they're told that if they speak out, their lives will be ruined before they even truly began.
It's a tragically effective way to maintain control. You know, when I was going through Busby's statement, there was this one thing that really got to me. He talked about how this pattern, it wasn't just about targeting individuals. It was about creating this system, this whole network where people around the abuser become complicit.
Right. It's like it takes a village, but in a really messed up way.
Exactly. And he specifically called out those bystanders, the people who might have seen what was happening but didn't do anything to stop it.
It's like turning a blind eye, because it's easier than confronting something uncomfortable. Or maybe even scary.
And then you have those who are more than just bystanders. Busby called them enablers. The ones who actually helped make the abuse happen, or at least made it easier for it to continue.
And that's where things start to get even darker, because it's not just about holding one person accountable anymore.
Right. This isn't just about Sean Combs. This is about a whole system that might have been propping him up. And this is where Busby's investigation, it expands beyond just Combs. He said he's planning to name other individuals and even corporations as defendants in these cases.
Oh, hold on.
Oh.
Corporations. What kind of corporations are we talking about?
He mentioned banks, pharmaceutical companies, even hotels.
Okay, now that's interesting.
Mhm.
What could they possibly be implicated in?
Well, that's what Busby's trying to prove. He's trying to show that these entities knew about the alleged abuse or even benefited from it somehow. Maybe they helped cover it up. Who knows? But if he can demonstrate that their involvement was that direct, it could mean huge legal trouble for them. And let's be real here, it would be a PR nightmare.
Yeah, you're telling me, imagine being tied to a scandal of this magnitude. It would be devastating.
Absolutely. And that's why this case, it's so much bigger than just one person's actions. This is about exposing a whole system, a culture that allows this kind of abuse to happen and even protects the abusers.
Right. It's like they're hiding in plain sight.
And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, to feel like there's nothing we can do to change a system that seems so ingrained.
It's true. It can feel like an impossible task. But it has to start somewhere, right?
Right. And maybe that's the first step, just acknowledging that this isn't just a Hollywood problem. This kind of abuse of power, it happens everywhere. And it's been happening for way too long.
It's about time we shine a light on it and hold people accountable.
Exactly. And one of the things that really hit me hard while reading through these accounts was this quote from a young man who left the industry because of what he says happened to him.
What did he say?
He said, "Had he not been in power, I feel like I could have been something great. I quit the industry because of what Sean Combs did to me."
That's heavy. It really makes you think about the human cost of all of this, the dreams that were shattered, the potential that was stolen.
It's a reminder that behind all the legal jargon and the headlines, there are real people whose lives have been forever changed by this.
And their stories deserve to be heard.
Yeah, and it's easy to get lost in it all, to feel like it's just too big, too overwhelming. What can we even do?
It's true. It can be paralyzing.
Yeah.
But I think the first step is simple. Believe survivors.
Believe and really listen,
Yep.
without judgment, without questioning their experience.
Exactly. Their courage in coming forward, especially after all this time, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And they deserve our support, not our skepticism.
Absolutely. And speaking of support, if someone's listening to this right now and they're relating to these stories, if they've been through something similar, what resources are out there for them?
Well, the first one that always comes to mind is the National Sexual Assault Hotline. It's a lifeline for so many people. That number is 800-656-4673.
And Busby's firm, they actually set up a dedicated hotline specifically for this case. That number is 1-802-107-4747. And he emphasized that all communication is confidential, protected by attorney-client privilege.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
And beyond those immediate resources, there are so many organizations doing incredible work to fight against sexual assault and support survivors. These groups are working to change the culture, to create a world where these kinds of abuses just aren't tolerated.
Because as we've been talking about this case, it really highlights that this is a systemic issue. This isn't just about one person's actions. It's about a culture that allows powerful individuals to exploit others, often for years, and get away with it.
Right. It's about power and control in the systems that protect abusers.
In this case, as horrific as it is, it has the potential to be a turning point.
It really does. Will force a reckoning, not just in the music industry, but in every industry where these power dynamics exist.
Will this be the thing that finally breaks the cycle of abuse and silence?
That's the question we're left with. And it's a question we all have a role in answering. Through our actions, our choices, our willingness to speak up and challenge these systems.
And maybe that's where the hope lies. Recognizing that we all have a part to play in creating a world where stories like these, while heartbreaking, become a relic of the past, not a reflection of the present.
Well said. It's up to all of us to keep asking these questions, to keep pushing for change, and to support survivors in any way we can.
It's been a heavy conversation, but an important one. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a privilege.
Yeah.
Ever wonder what happens to those photos taken at, like, public events? Who owns them? Can they be used however anyone wants?
Yeah.
Well, get ready to dive into this fascinating legal case. It's about a photo that ended up in Vibe magazine.
Oh,
Back in 2006.
Vibe, huh?
Yeah, it might seem like, just celebrity gossip.
Right.
But this case really gets to the heart of privacy rights and freedom of the press.
Yeah.
Something that affects all of us.
It really does. It's a classic example of how New York civil rights law tries to balance these competing interests. You see, celebrities, they do have legal protection when it comes to their image.
Mm.
And this case really shines a light on how those protections work in the real world.
So let's set the scene. Back in 2003, Sean Combs,
Okay.
Puff Daddy, P. Diddy.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, he threw one of his famous white parties in East Hampton.
Ah.
These were massive events. And this one in particular ended up, being the center of our legal story. So Vibe magazine, they did a feature article on Sean Combs a few years later.
Okay.
In November of 2006. And included some photos from those parties.
Okay.
Seems harmless enough.
Well, one of the pictures from the 2003 party, it showed 3 women dressed as mermaids.
Okay.
The catch. They were topless.
Oh, wow.
And one of those women, Maria Cristina Dominguez, she decided to take legal action because she said she never consented to being photographed topless or having that image published.
So Dominguez sued Vibe magazine, Sean Combs, and Bad Boy Entertainment, saying they violated her privacy. Her argument was based on New York civil rights law,
Right.
which basically says you can't use someone's image for commercial purposes without their permission. That seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But the defendants, they had a pretty strong defense.
Okay.
They claimed the newsworthiness exception applied in this case.
Yeah.
They argued that the photo was part of a story about Sean Combs, a public figure, and his well-known party, which, by its very nature, attracts public interest.
Okay, so we've got this legal battle brewing an individual's right to privacy versus freedom of the press. What did the court have to say about all this?
Well, the judge sided with the defendants
Oh,
and dismissed the case.
wow.
The key here was the real relationship test.
Okay.
The judge ruled that the photo did have a real relationship to the article about Sean Combs.
Okay.
What's interesting is that the court, they even acknowledged that the picture might have boosted the magazine's sales, but that didn't mean it wasn't related to the story.
So even though the magazine might have benefited commercially, the context of the photo within the article mattered more.
Yeah.
That's a pretty nuanced distinction.
Exactly. And there's another point in the ruling that I think is really fascinating.
Okay.
The judge basically said it wasn't their job to question the magazine's editorial decisions about what's newsworthy, as long as those decisions were reasonable.
Wait, so who decides what's reasonable?
Right.
Doesn't that give publishers a lot of power?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of how the law tries to balance these, complicated issues. It's not always, black and white.
Right.
The court, they look at things like the article's content, the photo's prominence, and the context of the publication to figure out if that newsworthiness exception applies.
So there's some wiggle room, but it's not a free pass for publishers.
Right.
They still have to be able to defend their choices in court.
Yeah.
This newsworthiness exception seems like a pretty big deal. Where did it come from?
Well, it's deeply rooted in the Hearst Amendment.
Okay.
And the idea that a free press is vital to a functioning democracy. The courts have long recognized that journalists need a certain level of protection to report on matters of public concern without fear of being sued for every photo or piece of information they publish.
Okay, so it's about balancing the public's need for information with an individual's right to privacy.
Right.
But how do we ensure that this newsworthiness exception isn't abused? Where do we draw the line?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that courts grapple with constantly. There are limitations to the exception. It's not a carte blanche for publishers to do whatever they want.
Right.
For example, simply because someone is at a public event doesn't automatically strip them of all privacy rights.
That makes sense. So going back to Dominguez, even though she was at a public party, the court still had to consider whether using her photo in that specific way was justified under this exception.
Precisely. And this is where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Remember, Dominguez wasn't a public figure like Sean Combs.
Right.
She was, for all intents and purposes, an average person who happened to be at this event.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this case really raises questions about what happens when, everyday people, not just celebrities, find themselves in the spotlight. Like, you could be at a concert or a sporting event and end up in a photo that gets published. Does that mean anyone can just use your image without your consent?
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
The context matters a lot. In Dominguez's case, the court focused on the real relationship between her photo and the article's subject matter.
Okay.
The connection to the story about Sean Combs and his parties, that was really key to the ruling.
So if someone had just snapped a random picture of her at the grocery store
Right.
and tried to sell it to a tabloid, that would be a different story.
Absolutely. The newsworthiness exception wouldn't apply there because
No.
there's no clear connection to a newsworthy event
Yeah.
or a public figure.
This makes me think about those paparazzi photos you see of celebrities doing, like, everyday things.
Yeah.
Where do those fit in?
The paparazzi.
Yeah.
They operate in a bit of a gray area,
Hmm.
legally and ethically. Celebrities might be public figures,
Cool.
but they still have some expectation of privacy,
Okay.
especially when it comes to their personal lives.
Yeah.
So the courts have to weigh those interests against the public's interest in seeing those images.
It feels like things get even more complicated with, like, social media.
Oh, yeah.
Anyone can be a photographer and publisher these days.
Right.
Imagine you're at a concert and someone in the crowd, they snap a photo of you dancing
Yeah.
and post it online. Do they need your permission?
That's a great question. And it highlights how technology is constantly pushing the boundaries of these legal concepts. The law is still catching up to the realities of social media and, widespread image sharing.
So what are the key takeaways for our listener here? What should they keep in mind when it comes to their own photos and privacy in this, like, wild world of digital photography?
Well, I think awareness is key.
Okay.
When you're in public, especially at events where photography is common, there's always a chance that someone might capture your image. You might not have much control over that initial act of taking the picture, but you do have legal options if your image is used in a way that violates your privacy rights.
So knowing your rights is crucial. This case also brings up some, like, ethical questions for anyone taking and sharing photos, even casually on social media.
Yeah.
Just because you can post something doesn't mean you should.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even if something is technically legal, it doesn't automatically mean it's the right thing to do.
Right.
We all have a responsibility to consider the potential impact our actions might have on others.
You mentioned earlier that the court didn't want to second-guess the magazine's editorial decisions about what's considered newsworthy,
Right.
as long as those decisions were reasonable. But who ultimately gets to define what's reasonable?
That's a tricky one.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. The courts have to consider a whole range of factors, like, the content of the article, how prominently the photo is displayed, and the individual's expectation of privacy in that particular situation. It's very case specific.
It seems like a lot of responsibility falls on journalists and publishers to make, ethical choices, even if the law gives them some leeway.
Exactly. This case really underscores the importance of responsible journalism. While the law provides a framework, it's ultimately up to those in the media to weigh the public's right to know against an individual's right to privacy.
This conversation has been incredibly insightful. It really makes you think twice about the power of images and the responsibility that comes with taking and sharing them.
That's what's so fascinating about this topic. The more we explore it, the more we realize how complex and nuanced it really is, and how technology continues to challenge our understanding of these issues.
We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like there's still more to unpack. Yeah. The judge's decision not to question the magazine's judgment about what's newsworthy, that really stuck with me. Yeah. It makes you wonder about the balance of power in these situations.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It raises questions about the boundaries of editorial freedom and whether there should be more checks and balances in place.
Right. If the courts are reluctant to step in, does that mean it's up to the media to, like, police itself? And what happens when different publications have vastly different ideas of what's considered newsworthy?
You've hit on a crucial issue. Who gets to be the gatekeeper of what the public sees and knows?
Yeah.
These are questions that have been debated for centuries, and they're even more relevant now in the age of digital media,
Right.
where information spreads so rapidly.
It's a lot to consider. And it goes beyond, like, legal arguments to encompass ethical and societal questions about the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. It's about finding a balance that protects individual rights, while also allowing for a free and open flow of information.
So for our listener who might be thinking, this is all interesting, but what does it mean for me? What's the bottom line here?
I think The biggest takeaway is that everyone has a role to play in shaping the future of privacy and freedom of expression. Whether you're a journalist, a photographer, or simply someone who uses social media, being aware of these issues and making conscious choices is crucial.
So we talked about how the court emphasized the real relationship between Dominguez's photo and the Vibe article about Sean Combs. Can you, give our listener a better understanding of what the courts consider a real relationship? What are they looking for exactly?
Well, it's not about whether the photo is, aesthetically pleasing or even if it's the most important piece of the story.
Right.
The courts are mainly concerned with whether the photo, genuinely contributes to the article's narrative. Does it help tell the story? Does it provide context or understanding that words alone can't convey?
So it's not just about throwing in a random picture for shock value.
Right.
Or to, boost sales.
Sure.
There has to be a legitimate connection to the subject matter.
Exactly. And the courts will look at the article as a whole, not just the photo in isolation.
Okay.
They'll consider the captions, the surrounding text, and the overall message the publication is trying to convey.
This is where that editorial judgment comes into play again, right?
Yeah.
The publisher has to make a case for why that specific photo is necessary to tell that particular story.
Precisely. And while the courts generally give publishers some leeway in making those decisions, it's not a blank check.
Okay.
If the connection between the photo and the story is weak, or if the photo is deemed to be, excessively intrusive or exploitative, the court might step in and say, hold on, this crosses the line.
So there's a balance to be struck between protecting freedom of the press and safeguarding individual privacy rights.
That's the crux of it. And this case really highlights how difficult it can be to find that, sweet spot. There's no easy formula, and the courts are constantly grappling with these complex issues.
This entire deep dive has been so illuminating. It really makes you think about the power of images and the responsibility we all have in this digital age.
I agree. It's a conversation that we need to be having, especially as technology continues to blur the lines between, public and private.
So any final thoughts for our listener who's now armed with all this knowledge about privacy, photography, and the law? What's the one thing you want them to take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important message is that awareness is key.
Yeah.
Be mindful of the images you capture and share, both as a photographer and as a consumer of media. Think about the stories behind those images and the potential impact they might have.
Well said. It's about being thoughtful and respectful, even in a world that's increasingly driven by visuals.
Exactly. And remember, the law is constantly evolving to keep pace with technology and societal norms. So stay informed, stay curious, and keep questioning the world around you.
That's great advice. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. And a huge thanks to you, our listener, for tuning in. Until next time, keep exploring. All right, strap yourselves in. All right, so welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to unpack some pretty intriguing legal documents, and these are straight from case text. So get this, it's a lawsuit. It's from March 2024. It's titled Emmerich v. Combs. And yeah, that Combs is Sean Combs, the one and only P. Diddy, along with Bad Boy Entertainment and Atlantic Records. So what we're going to try to figure out today is what exactly are the claims here, and how did the judge rule?
Well, it's a fascinating case, especially when you consider the plaintiff, Ronald Emmerich. He's filed over 200 lawsuits since 2013. I mean, that's just a staggering number, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
It actually earned him what's called a vexatious litigant order in Florida, which basically suggests a pattern of potentially frivolous lawsuits. So knowing this right from the start, I think, probably colored the judge's perspective.
Over 200 lawsuits. Wow. Makes you wonder, what's going on there. But let's get into the specifics of this case. What exactly is Emmerich claiming happened with Atlantic Records?
Well, the first part of his claim stems from some interactions he had with Atlantic. Back in 2006, he sent them a demo CD, and he even received a call from Ahmet Erdogan, the label's co-founder. Emmerich claims that Erdogan told him to sign with another label. But here's the interesting part. Emmerich doesn't actually allege any wrongdoing by Atlantic.
Wait, hold on. He's suing them, but doesn't claim they did anything wrong. That seems a little contradictory, doesn't it?
Exactly. It really raises questions about the basis of his claim. And this lack of a concrete injury was likely a red flag for the judge from the get-go. It kind of speaks to a larger point of the legal system, Anyone can file a lawsuit, but there are, specific requirements that must be met, like demonstrating a legitimate harm.
So how does Sean Combs, a.k.a. P. Diddy, fit into all of this? This is where things get really
Yeah.
interesting, right?
Okay.
This part of the lawsuit is even more intriguing. Emirates actually focusing on Sean Combs' public image, specifically after a separate lawsuit was filed against him by Cassandra Ventura. We won't get into the details of that case, but it provides some important context. So is Emirates suggesting that, because there are allegations against Combs, he shouldn't be allowed to, continue with endorsements and public appearances?
Essentially, yes. He even specifically mentions Ciroc vodka billboards as being a public nuisance. Emirates seems to be arguing that anyone who continues to work with Combs, in this case Bad Boy Entertainment and Atlantic Records, is somehow complicit in causing harm. He even uses legal terms like tortious interference with business relations and products liability torts.
Okay, let's unpack those terms a bit for our listener. Tortious interference. What exactly does that mean in this context?
So, in simple terms, tortious interference means that someone wrongfully interfered with a contractual or business relationship, causing damage. So, Emirate is suggesting that by continuing to work with Combs and promote his products, the defendants are somehow harming him and potentially other consumers.
So he's trying to say that seeing a Ciroc billboard is causing him some kind of quantifiable harm. Help me. Help me understand how this even constitutes an injury in the eyes of the law.
Yeah, that's precisely the point that the judge zeroed in on. In legal terms, Emirate failed to demonstrate a concrete injury in fact, which is a requirement for a court to have jurisdiction. He complained about billboards being eyesores, but didn't explain how they specifically harmed him.
It sounds like he's stretching the definition of legal injury pretty thin.
Yeah.
And what about those product liability torts he mentioned?
Right. Well, product liability claims typically involve defective products that cause physical harm or property damage. It's unclear how Emirate is connecting that to Sean Combs' public image or the actions of the record labels. It's a bit of a head-scratcher.
It really does make you wonder what the strategy was here, especially when you consider what Emirate was seeking as a remedy.
Oh, absolutely. He asked for a staggering $45 million in damages. And he didn't stop there. He also wanted Bad Boy Entertainment forced into bankruptcy and receivership. It's a very bold ask, wouldn't you say?
That's putting it mildly. It seems incredibly ambitious, especially given the shaky foundation of the lawsuit.
You're right. And unsurprisingly, the judge wasn't convinced. The case was dismissed because Emirate couldn't articulate a legitimate legal injury. In the judge's own words, absent these types of specific allegations, his complaint reflects nothing more than generalized grievances, which cannot support standing.
So even with a high-profile defendant like Sean Combs, the lawsuit ultimately crumbled because it lacks a solid legal basis and a demonstrable injury. It's a good reminder that the law requires more than just strong opinions or general grievances to move forward.
That's a key takeaway here, and we'll discuss its implications in more detail in just a minute. It's almost like the legal system has like a built-in safeguard against people who might be abusing it. You can't just throw around legal terms and expect to win millions.
It's an interesting point you raised. This whole concept of a vexatious litigant, it's kind of fascinating.
It is. Essentially, courts have recognized that some individuals might use litigation as a tool for harassment or to gain notoriety rather than to seek genuine redress. And the vexatious litigant order placed on Emirate in Florida really suggests that the courts have identified a concerning pattern in his history of lawsuits.
It makes you wonder about the implications. For people who might have legitimate claims, right? But they're then viewed with skepticism because someone like Emirate has clogged up the system with frivolous lawsuits.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. The actions of a few can impact the perception of many, and that's a difficult hurdle to overcome.
So putting aside Emirate's litigious history for a moment, let's talk about this concept of injury in fact, because it seems pretty crucial in this case. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Oh, absolutely. Injury in fact is a core principle in legal standing. It means a plaintiff must have suffered a concrete, particularized, and actual or imminent harm. It can't just be a hypothetical or generalized grievance. Think of it this way. If you go to court, you need to show the judge that you've been personally and directly affected by the defendant's actions.
Okay, so that makes sense. So in Emirate's case, simply being annoyed by Ciroc billboards doesn't meet that threshold.
Right.
It's just a subjective feeling, not a quantifiable injury.
Exactly. The judge needed to see evidence of, tangible harm like financial loss or emotional distress or reputational damage directly linked to the billboards. Emirate simply didn't provide that.
It's interesting how this case touches on broader societal questions too, I think, especially about like the intersection of public image, free speech, and the law. We have P. Diddy as a celebrity with a huge public persona. And then you have Emmerich trying to make a legal argument based on his image.
Yeah. You've hit on a really intriguing point. This case raises the question, can someone's public image alone ever be grounds for a lawsuit? Or are there always other factors that need to be present?
It's a tricky question.
Right.
On the one hand, we don't want to stifle free speech. People should be able to express opinions, even if they're, critical of others. But on the other hand, we also want to protect individuals from harm, including, harm to their reputation.
It's a delicate balance, for sure. Where do we draw the line between legitimate criticism and actions that cause genuine harm? And how do we define that harm in a legal context?
Yeah, it makes you think about the implications for public figures in general. Should they be held to a different standard when it comes to, like, legal action?
That's a great question. And it's one that, courts are grappling with more and more these days, especially in the digital age. We live in a world where information, spreads like wildfire online, and reputations can be damaged in an instant. So it raises questions about, the limits of free speech and the need for greater accountability, but also the potential for misuse and censorship.
And in this case, Emmerich is also going after the record companies that are associated with Combs. He's suggesting they're somehow responsible for his perceived harm because they continue to work with Combs. Is that even a valid legal argument?
It's a stretch, to say the least. He's essentially arguing, guilt by association, holding a business liable, simply because they have a relationship with someone who is accused of wrongdoing, but hasn't been found guilty in a court of law. That's a slippery slope.
It feels like he's reaching for anything he can to build a case, but without that, like, core element of demonstrable harm, it all falls apart.
Yeah, it's a great example of how a lawsuit, even one with, a high-profile defendant, and complex legal terminology can be completely undermined by a lack of fundamental legal grounding.
So what does this all mean for our listener? What's the key takeaway here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that, the law is nuanced and complex, but there are, core principles that need to be met.
Even if you're going up against someone like P. Diddy, you still need to have a solid legal argument.
Right.
Just feeling annoyed or offended by someone's public image, that's not enough to win in court.
Exactly. You need to be able to show that concrete injury. And this case really highlights another crucial point, I think. The legal system, while it's designed to protect individual rights, can also be misused. So we need to be mindful of this balance, I think, and understand the potential consequences of frivolous or vexatious litigation.
Like you said earlier, the actions of a few can impact many. And Emmerich's pattern of lawsuits, even if this one was dismissed, it might make people more skeptical of future plaintiffs.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the importance of, being informed, not just about the law itself, but about, the actors involved and their motivations. It encourages us to think critically, about the information we consume and to question assumptions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Emmerich v. Combs, I'm still left wondering, could there ever be a scenario where public image concerns alone could actually form a valid legal claim? It feels like uncharted territory, legally speaking. Where does free speech end and harm begin when it comes to public image?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and one that legal scholars are really grappling with right now, especially, as you said, as our world becomes increasingly digital. Think about it. Social media, it allows information, both true and false, to spread at an unprecedented rate. Reputations can be built and destroyed like that in the blink of an eye.
So how do we, reconcile that with the need to protect individuals from, baseless attacks or attempts to, manipulate public opinion? Is there a way to establish, clear legal boundaries without stifling legitimate discourse?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a complex issue with it. No easy answers. On the one hand, we have freedom of speech, which protects, individuals' right to express their opinions and even criticize others. But on the other hand, we also want to protect individuals from harm, including harm to their reputation.
And as we've seen in this case, right, with Emmerich and Sean Combs, it's not always easy to determine where one ends and the other begins, especially when you add in
the layer of celebrity and public image.
Right, because with someone like Sean Combs, his public image is so intricately tied to his brand and his business. So does criticism of his actions or behavior cross the line into something that can be legally actionable if it impacts his business? These are the kinds of questions that courts may need to address more and more in the future.
It raises a whole host of ethical and legal considerations, doesn't it? Like,
Yep.
how do you prove intent to harm? How do you measure the damage caused by negative public opinion? And who gets to decide? What constitutes harm in this context? Is it purely financial, or does it encompass emotional distress or damage to one's reputation? These are thorny issues that require careful consideration.
It's definitely making me think differently about the power of public image
Yeah.
and how it interacts with the legal system. We often see public figures embroiled in controversies that play out in the court of public opinion. But this case highlights how those controversies can spill over into actual legal battles.
It is. It's a reminder that the law is constantly evolving to keep pace with
Right.
societal changes and technological advancements. What might have been considered a frivolous claim a few decades ago could potentially form the basis for a legitimate lawsuit in the future, as our understanding of harm and reputation evolves.
So while we may not have definitive answers today, I think this deep dive into Everett v. Combs has certainly given us a lot to ponder.
It has. It's a case that really underscores the importance of our critical thinking and a nuanced understanding of the law. It encourages us to look beyond the surface and to consider the broader implications of seemingly outlandish legal claims.
And it also reminds us
Yeah.
that the law is a living, breathing entity, constantly adapting to the challenges of a changing world. Who knows, maybe one day we'll be revisiting this very case as like a precedent-setting decision that reshaped the legal landscape.
Only time will tell. But one thing is for sure. The intersection of law, public image, and free speech is sure to generate even more fascinating legal battles in the years to come.
And we'll be here to break them down for you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.